Coming up on Public Affairs Today, do you see cops as all the same? There are some distinct personality types on the force. We'll talk about police culture coming up next.
This program was made possible by a grant from the UCF College of Health and Public Affairs, which promotes excellence in undergraduate and graduate education, research, and community service in health-related professions and public affairs.
Hello and welcome to Public Affairs Today. I'm Alicia Callanan Mandigo. Public affairs is a dynamic, multifaceted field that touches your life in everyday ways you may not realize. Issues of law, charitable work, and social work are just some of the things that fall under the public affairs umbrella. The topic on the table today is some fascinating research on police culture. But first, you could identify a culture within certain areas of crime, and intimate partner abuse is one of those areas. The victims are all around us, and most of the time, we don't even know it, which is why Harbor House recently sat down with graduate students from UCF School of Social Work within the College of Health and Public Affairs to talk about what to look for. It can be happening anywhere, to just about anyone. The official description is intimate partner violence. You may know it as domestic abuse.
Sometimes we think about domestic violence or intimate partner violence as, well, it's slapping, shoving, pushing, but that is not what really comprises this cycle of violence, this type of violence. It could be a simple threat. And if you have had a hole in the wall punched right over your head and you've never been punched, you don't need to be punched because that threat and intimidation is always there. If your partner has a gun, a knife, sleeps with a knife, and threatens you with it, they don't have to actually stab you.
In the first half of 2010, Florida's major cities saw crime drop, but domestic violence murders rose. According to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement statistics, that specific category of murders rose by 5.8% from the year before. Some are blaming the economy, but maybe we're just not doing a good enough job of recognizing trouble.
If you've never been to court, then you probably don't understand just how intimidating that process is.
Which is why these UCF social work graduate students are listening to Harbor House Shelter Services Manager Robin Landwehr. No matter where these students end up professionally, they're likely to cross paths with a victim of intimate partner violence.
In our program, in most social work programs, we want to teach our students about intimate partner violence because it's so prevalent. As I said, most dangerous place for a woman is her home. Many of our students think, well, I'm not going to work in a domestic violence shelter, and so that is not content that I need. And that is completely erroneous because whether you work in private practice, whether you work for children's services, whether you work in the court system, whether you work in the health field, whether you work in adoption, whether you work in elderly, whether you work in oncology, every one of those fields is going to see some domestic violence. And so we integrate it throughout our curriculum so that students leaving here know what to do.
It's not just about being able to recognize the signs of injury. It's about being able to recognize someone experiencing things like isolation, coercion, intimidation.
We tend to think it's about the physical violence, and certainly that is a terrible thing that does occur. But that's an episode that happens and then is over. The ongoing abuse, the daily emotional abuse, the daily mind games, the daily intimidation, the daily use of children, the daily financial monitoring, that really is what victims talk about as being the worst to their person, their self-esteem, their being, their how to live their life.
This graduate student is planning to be a personal therapist, but decided to work at Harbor House as part of her clinical studies.
I'll be honest, at first it was really intimidating. It really was. I mean, because I'm probably like most people, I don't want to go near that. I mentioned it to my sister who has a master's in psychology too, and she said over the phone, she was just like, No. Most people don't want to deal with it, and I think that's part of the problem.
And the most important thing to do, and this is what I would really like to leave you with, is if you see someone that you believe is being battered, that you should ask them, and not, are you being battered, but rather, is someone hurting you? Is there something I can do for you? Is there something like that, because it's a secret still. People don't share it. And that secondly, as a professional, not as a friend, but as a professional, if you know someone is being battered, you should always help them to make a safety plan. Should it happen again, what will you do to keep yourself and or your children or pets safe? And so that's really what the thrust of our intervention strategies with our students are in the beginning level of social work and of course later clinical intervention.
That's what these graduate students are learning here. The victims need to get out, but they need to get out safely. Harbor House offers free monthly educational presentations on the dynamics of domestic violence. We'll have the web address available later in the show. Joining me now is Dr. Jean Paolini from UCF's Department of Criminal Justice within the College of Health and Public Affairs. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
You've done some really interesting research on what you're referring to as police culture, which I think is something that fascinates people across the board. We see it in movies and in television shows, or at least what we think is a portrayal of police culture. So I think we should start with you explaining what that term means.
Yeah, and that's part of the fantasy out there of the police culture, is that there is this depiction of the stereotypical go-getter police officer that at all costs will do things to do what they think is the right thing. Unfortunately, we also know that there's variation in policing approaches, and there's not just one approach to policing. And when my research highlights much of that, where we talk about differences in approaches in terms of how do they see the world, how do they deal with the organization, how do they deal with citizens. And while there are officers who embody some of those values of the traditional culture, or what we might think of as a traditional culture, there's also varying approaches as well.
Well, let's refer back to a minute to the topic on domestic violence. And when you're talking about approaching and culture, domestic violence, domestic calls are among the most dangerous calls that a cop can go on.
Yes.
So is there a particular mindset that cops approach a domestic call with?
Well, one, they know it's a dangerous call, but also calls like domestic violence and other high-intensity calls, they allow officers to display their style. Some approaches may be more conciliatory. Other approaches may be, at the time, you have to be more firm with people. That's where you get to see officer style come out, but they do know that those are dangerous calls. What works for one officer doesn't work for another officer.
Okay, but that also is an area where an officer may have less discretion because there are mandatory arrest laws. The whole domestic violence thing kind of falls in a different area of law, doesn't it?
Yes. Yeah, if there's abuse that's happening, or if there is somebody that can be identified as the perpetrator or somebody that's identified as the victim, their discretion is constrained considerably. But arguing among two couples, or arguing among partners, or family members, those are high intensity calls, and they are very stressful for the officer.
Okay, so when we're talking about the different kinds of cops, again, referring back to the movies and television, we have two categories, right? There's good cop and bad cop. And you're finding that that it's not quite that clear cut. What kinds of things have you found?
Well, based on the attitudes that I examine, there are styles that are portrayed, and I don't want to say bad cop versus good cop, but different approaches. Some of them are more get tough, depending on how they see the role or their role in society. But as we've seen differences in the composition of police forces, you have more females, you have more ethnic minorities, more college-educated officers, you have changing philosophies in policing. That brings with it different approaches, and we do see those different approaches play out.
Okay, so let's delve a little bit into that. One of the things that you needed to do in the beginning of your research was sort of establish some models, because this was an area that hadn't been explored before.
Yeah, it's been explored, but it's one of those concepts like love. You kind of understand it, but everybody's interpretation of it is different. And when I set out to do this, I was under the assumption as a graduate student that there would be a theory of police culture, excuse me, that I could test. And when I went out into the literature for months and months, it was very scattery. There was kind of this thumbnail sketch of what you should expect. So one of the first things that I did was put together all the tidbits that people have done and some significant work, and put together a model to say, look, this is exactly what we're talking about when we consider that traditional approach. Unfortunately, I wasn't buying into all cops are the same, so I had to build a model that I then began to tear down in various capacities through some empirical research.
Well, when you talk about the thumbnail sketch that you started with as a graduate student, it was that all cops are the same? That's where you started?
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
and I was basically, my hypothesis was cops are not the same, so we should see differences in their approaches attitudinally, and I did find some rather significant differences.
Okay, why did you have that idea? Is it simply because people are individuals and so cops should therefore be individuals?
I've done some observational research. That was my main methodology. The data that I use to test my own hypotheses are from attitudinal surveys. But, you know, if you have family members that are police officers, if you encounter police officers, you know that they have some similarities like most occupational groups, but they're not all the same in terms of their day-to-day workings or how they see the world.
I spent some time down in Fort Myers and had a chance to get to know some cops down there. I was down there at a time when there was some significant drug action coming in off the coast. A lot of the shrimp boats were bringing in drugs, so there was a lot of criminal activity. So I developed friendships with detectives from the Sheriff's Department and the DEA, and then the U.S. Attorney. And I found, just personally, that they had kind of different postures, I guess you could say. The guys that I knew from the Sheriff's Department had a tendency to be very macho. They didn't go anywhere without their ankle holsters. They had a tendency to pick fights with people, egg people on that didn't know that they were cops. The DEA agent that I knew had a completely different approach. He was almost never armed. He never wanted people to know that he was part of law enforcement. They were fighting the same fight down there. So these guys interacted all the time.
Yeah, that's an interesting example because in those circumstances, you do have a single mission to fight crime, whereas the average patrol officer has to do a variety of things. They have to provide services, they have to maintain order, and they have to do crime fighting as well. And empirically, we know that's the thing they do least. When you get into drug agents and investigators, their sole mission is to make an arrest. So you can even see differences in style among people with a constrained role orientation, that they're only focusing on crime fighting. But there are, again, different ways to do that. And we see that with patrol officers, we see that with investigators as well.
So when it comes to the idea of the guys that had to always have their guns versus the DEA agent who never carried his gun, and his opinion was if you needed a gun then you were feeling insecure about your manhood. That's what he would say all the time. How do those two personalities play into the kinds of observations that you've been making through your research?
Well, I guess some of that would have to do with perceptions of danger, less about how you feel about yourself, but maybe some folks that say, look, this is a dangerous world. I see the worst in society more than you do, and I know what bad things are out there. Myself, I don't delve into perceptions of danger in terms of needing to carry the weapon, but it is an interesting anecdote for sure.
You were actually able to break down personality types, give them some labels. The one that stuck in my head that I love is the Dirty Harry cop. You know, who's going to forget that one, right? So if you could just talk a little about the different labels that you were able to create.
Yeah, and those were, you know, ways to remember instead of saying cluster 1 or cluster 2. I was looking at, and I still am looking at, role orientations, how they do the role, police officers, if they're aggressive in their approach, and not in a corrupt way, but are they aggressive in checking people and stopping people and patting people down? Are they selective in what they do, or are they focusing on a wide variety of things? What are their views of citizens? What are their views of supervisors? Those kinds of attitudes comprise these styles. The labels that came out was, I have some traditional cops that I call traditionalists, some cops that don't believe in doing a lot of crime fighting. They're not lazy, they don't see the world that way. Some peacekeepers, what I call. And the Dirty Harry enforcers were just a way to show that one of my main dimensions was how do you feel about procedural guidelines? Meaning, sometimes could you overlook some procedural guidelines and some due process considerations as long as you're doing the right thing? And the Dirty Harry enforcers were the ones that aligned with that the most, that they believe sometimes you have to overlook procedural guidelines. How that plays out in terms of their behavior may be a totally different ballgame.
What are a couple of the other personalities you were able to identify?
One I called.
There were 5, right?
There were 7.
7. Okay.
Yeah, there were, and they aligned very closely with traditional research on typologies. And there's a host of typology research studies that have been conducted that show variation in the way officers see the world. So I was also going along with that research as well. My groups were, the traditionalists, as I mentioned, the peacekeepers, the Dirty Harry enforcers, and those kind of what I call the LALOs, their very mellow approach to policing. And they varied in terms of how they deal with the occupational world, which is what I call the street environment, and then the organizational environment dealing with supervisors. Because as police officers know, sometimes the organizational environment is as dangerous as the occupational world on the street, where there's guns being pointed at you and people trying to hurt you.
We're going to pick up with that in just a minute, but first we're going to take a quick break. Stay with us. Thanks for staying with us. Again, we're talking with Dr. Jean Paolini from UCS Department of Criminal Justice within the College of Health and Public Affairs, and we're talking about police culture. And going into the break, you were talking about the occupational environment versus the organizational environment, and that sometimes the organizational environment can be more dangerous. First explain what the organizational environment means.
Dealing with supervisors, dealing with the rules and regulations of policing, as many know or don't know, there are a lot of rules for police officers. They have to follow rules. In fact, you can do something good substantively, get drugs off the street, get guns off the street. If you don't follow the proper procedures, you can get sanctioned for that, even if you do a good job. So in that sense, there are what researchers refer to policing as a punishment-centered bureaucracy, where if you're identified, it's usually for something you've done wrong rather than something you've done well. And that's just the approach of policing.
Okay, so then that has to translate somehow to how a cop deals with people on the street. If he's feeling the heat when he's in the department, then when he gets out on the street, then he's got to be carrying that with him.
It could be. Police officers sometimes they have good home life balance. If there's ways to, shrug things off, some officers may internalize that and then go out on the street. Some officers, with my attitudes, found that they like to be on the street. They'd rather be on the street than be in the organization. The less they have to deal with the organization, the better. They'll deal with citizens on the street. And in terms of attitudes, there is a great deal of variation in terms of how officers feel about their supervisors. Whether or not they take that to the street with them is not something that I've delved into empirically, but you could imagine, as in your own occupation, if you feel stress from your organization or from your department, it will affect the way that you do your job.
In your research, you talk about attitude, behavior, relationships. Can you explain a little bit about that, how that works in a practical way?
Yeah, practically you would think that your attitudes would translate to behavior. Empirically, on the social science end, we have very little evidence that this works. This plays out, that your attitudes affect your behavior. and some have said it's the way that we're measuring attitudes. When we've conducted, myself included, a cluster analysis of these attitudes and said there's different styles, there are groups that are what I call that pro-police culture. Among those 7 groups, there was 3 that were the pro-police culture.
The very fraternal cops.
Yeah, and then there were the polar opposites that didn't align attitudinally with that pro-police culture, the traditional type approach, getting tough and seeing citizens as the enemy type thing. But we actually found, a colleague of mine, Bill Terrell from Michigan State University, he's a use of force person, and we're working together. We found a connection attitudinally between officers' attitudes and their behavior with respect to the use of force, and also with respect to searches of people and their vehicles during traffic stops.
Are you able to share some of that with us? What were some of the findings?
Yeah, some of the findings were that police officers that were what we call pro-police culture versus those that were con-police culture, the other end of the spectrum. And we had a group that hung in the middle. They shared some of those approaches, but they weren't as pro as the pros and as con as the cons. They were more likely to use force. They were more likely to use higher levels of force, that is the pro-police culture group, compared to the con. They also, pro-police culture groups were more likely to search people and their vehicles during traffic stops than the con. So that was pretty exciting for us.
Now, were you able to look at whether the pro-police culture folks also were more in line with the dirty, hairy, if I need to bypass protocols, I will? Yeah,
the folks that were in that group would be more likely to endorse those values. And the dirty, hairy enforcers were one of the 7 groups that were analytically distinct, but were more like the pro culture. When you compared them to 2 other groups, they were very similar. Yeah.
Now, I would imagine that there's also has to be some variable between how cops behave, what their attitudes are, their behaviors, and where they are geographically, and then what kind of enforcement they're doing, the sheriff's office versus the DEA.
Right. Geography matters, where you're assigned and also when you're assigned. If you're on a night shift and you're dealing with a lot of crime and you're dealing with a lot of bad things, as police officers would say, that can affect your view of the world. That can affect the way you do your job. If you imagine that some police officers may be more suspicious of citizens than others, it could be a function of the job that they do. If they're into drugs, enforcing drug laws, that may be a higher level of suspicion for them and a higher sense of danger than maybe somebody that's in a suburban area where there's really no crime.
Okay, and then also, does agency matter?
Sure, yeah. The chief's leadership, the sheriff's leadership, the types of things that they're doing. If you have smaller departments, and they don't always have to be small, but in more suburban areas, the way that they run their department may not be so bottom line oriented with respect to crime. They want to control crime, but they don't have much, maybe don't have much crime to control. The agency itself certainly does matter.
Another issue that you brought up was how long an officer has been on the job. And that apparently can have some influence on his outlook. Some cops are able to work for many years and still maintain what you might call a positive outlook, and others become very cynical and very jaded.
Yeah, we do know empirically that over the course of a police officer's career, he or she can definitely, they usually become less aggressive, they're less likely to use force. And it's not that they're skirting issues. They may have other ways to resolve issues, maybe with their mouth, verbalizing something instead of using another type of force. In terms of cynicism, empirically they say that cops over time maybe become more cynical. But I don't think that's different than any other occupational group. If you work in the media for 25 years, I'm sure that over time you become cynical in the way you do your job.
I don't think it takes much time at all for folks in the media to become cynical. Tell me a little bit about why cops become cops.
Well, this is interesting, and this was something that I dabbled in with my observation. We did third-party observations, was my major methodology in graduate school. And I was always under the assumption that every police officer that I would talk to, I always wanted to be a police officer since I was a little boy or a little girl. But there are a variety of reasons. Some of it is material. Police officers want a job that's going to be stable. It's going to provide them with stability over time. They can also, with off-duty assignments, they can make a pretty good living, even though most police officers may feel as if they're underpaid. But the part that I really liked is some people just drift in. Bankers, people that drove for trucking companies and said, I drove all day for this company, why can't I drive as a police officer? I was so bored of sitting behind a desk, I wanted to get out and interact with people. And that was some of the myths about policing that I've learned to dispel over time, that everybody wanted to be a police officer who's a police officer since day one. It's simply not true.
That's really interesting, and I'm now wondering, the folks that do it as a career change, how do they make out?
They make out pretty well because they have some experience doing something else, and then they thus probably have more of an appreciation for what police officers can do. By appreciation, I mean, some police officers, again, I was under the assumption that everybody wanted to be the chief of police, and that's simply not true. Some police officers want to stay on patrol for 20 years, the whole career, because over time, the more experience you have as a patrol officer, the better your life becomes. You get to pick where you want to work in many agencies. You get to pick when you want to work in many agencies, so your life becomes better. And again, I was under the assumption that patrol officers would always want to rise through the ranks. Each successive rank that you go to, you become the lowest member in that area, so you get the worst shifts. You may have the worst areas of assignment.
Wow, that's really interesting. Well, I want to thank you again for joining us today. Again, I've been speaking with Dr. Gene Paolini from UCF's Department of Criminal Justice within the College of Health and Public Affairs. Thanks for joining us. Well, that's going to do it for now. I'm Alicia Callanan Mandigo, and thanks for watching Public Affairs Today.
This program was made possible by a grant from the UCF College of Health and Public Affairs, which promotes excellence in undergraduate and graduate education, research, and community service in health-related professions and public affairs.